Spain lost more than 200 people to heat in just 4 days this summer. France recorded over 2,700 heat-related deaths across 17 days in June alone. Across the whole continent, the confirmed toll has climbed past 10,000, and health agencies are still revising the count upward. Here's what should genuinely surprise you about those numbers. Southern Europe is supposed to be the part of the continent that's good at this. Spaniards, Italians, and Greeks have been living with brutal summer heat for generations. Their buildings, their siestas, their entire daily rhythm evolved around managing exactly this kind of weather. And yet, this year, the region that was supposed to be the most heat-adapted place on the continent produced some of its worst death tolls on record. That single fact it is, scientists have relied on for years. And if you stay with me to the end, you'll understand exactly what that assumption was, why it just failed. And I'll give you the one number researchers are now watching that matters more than the peak temperature on any given day. If you find yourself hooked by the way science actually corrects itself when the data stops cooperating, subscribe right now, because this is exactly the kind of story that keeps developing, and you'll want to be here for the next update. Let's start with exactly what happened, because the scale of this event is half the story. Beginning in late June of this year, an intense heat dome settled over Western Europe, driven by hot, dry air pulled north from the Sahara and trapped in place by low pressure systems sitting on either side of it. In some locations, temperatures ran as much as 18 degrees Celsius above their seasonal average. Records fell across at least 13 countries, including France, Spain, Italy, Germany, Belgium, Austria, and the United Kingdom. The World Health Organization has confirmed more than 1,300 excess deaths across Europe since late June, a number that has continued climbing as officials work through delayed mortality data, with some independent tallies now placing the cumulative toll well into 5 figures once you include the waves of heat that followed through July. In France, the National Public Health Agency reported over 2,000 excess deaths during the single week the June heatwave peaked. Germany and the Netherlands reported thousands more over that same 7-day stretch. In Spain, mortality monitoring data showed more than 200 deaths attributable to heat in just 4 days. At least 55 people drowned in France alone while trying to cool off in unsupervised water. World Weather Attribution, the international group of climate scientists who specialize in rapidly analyzing extreme events, concluded that the daytime and nighttime temperatures recorded during the worst of this heat wave would have been virtually impossible 50 years ago, back in 1976, before the world had warmed by the roughly 1.1 degrees Celsius it has warmed since. Now, here's the first twist, and it's the one that actually matters for this story. If you only looked at the headline numbers, you'd assume this is simply the story of a hotter planet producing a hotter, deadlier summer in a straight line everywhere. That's true as far as it goes, but it's not what has scientists genuinely rethinking their models right now. What's rattling researchers isn't just that the death toll is high, it's where the worst of it landed. For years, the working assumption in heat mortality research has been that populations acclimate to the climate they live in. Northern Europeans, the thinking goes, are physiologically and infrastructurally unprepared for extreme heat because they rarely experience it, which is exactly why past heat waves have produced disproportionately high death tolls in places like the UK, Germany, and the Netherlands, places without widespread air conditioning, without a cultural habit of afternoon shade and rest, without buildings designed to stay cool. Southern Europe, by that same logic, was supposed to be comparatively protected region where decades of living with serious heat had built in both behavioral and physiological resilience. This year, that protection didn't show up in the data the way the models expected. So let's clear up a term you're going to hear a lot in coverage of this story, because it's doing a lot of quiet work and it means something very specific. Acclimatization. It is not simply a fancy way of saying people get used to the heat. In heat mortality, research. It refers to a measurable set of physiological adaptations, things like a lower core body temperature threshold for triggering sweat, a more efficient cardiovascular response to heat stress, and behavioral adaptations layered on top, like scheduling outdoor work around the cooler parts of the day. For decades, epidemiological studies consistently found that the same absolute temperature produced a smaller relative spike in mortality in Mediterranean countries than it did in northern ones, because Mediterranean populations had, in effect, been training for this their entire lives. That relationship held up reliably enough that it became a load-bearing assumption in climate health models used to project future risk. And that's precisely the assumption this summer's numbers are now straining against. So let me ask you something before we go deeper, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments. If you had to guess which region of Europe was best prepared to survive an extreme heat wave, would you have guessed the Mediterranean South or somewhere further north? Drop a comment, because I think the honest answer says a lot about how far our intuitions about adaptation have drifted from what the data is actually starting to show. Here's the mechanism researchers point to when they try to explain the gap. Acclimatization protects you against heat that resembles what you've already survived. It does not scale indefinitely against heat that keeps setting new records, especially when those records are being set not just in daytime highs, but in nighttime lows. That distinction matters enormously, and it's one of the quieter findings driving this reassessment. The human body needs a period of genuine cooling overnight to recover from a hot day, for core temperature to drop, for the cardiovascular system to get a break from the strain of constantly shedding heat. When nighttime temperatures stay unusually high, and this summer's heat wave produced record-breaking overnight lows right alongside its record daytime highs, that recovery window shrinks or disappears entirely. A population that has spent generations adapting to hot days has not necessarily adapted to hot nights, because until recently, hot nights at this scale simply weren't part of the historical climate those adaptations evolved against. Southern Europe wasn't unprepared for the heat itself. It may have been unprepared for the loss of overnight relief that has traditionally made that heat survivable. Now, here's what makes this more interesting than the simple climate change is making everything worse everywhere equally that tends to dominate the conversation. There's a genuine, actively debated methodological story underneath these numbers, and it's worth understanding because it's exactly the kind of scientific self-correction that deserves more attention than it usually gets. We'll get there, because it's both more fascinating and more scientifically honest than either the doom narrative or the dismissive one. But first, let's be upfront about how contested some of these numbers actually are. Not everyone accepts the higher mortality estimates at face value, and that pushback deserves to be represented fairly. In the United Kingdom, researchers modeled roughly 2,700 heat-related deaths across the May and June heat waves, with climate change estimated to be responsible for a substantial share of that figure. Critics, including some commentators writing in outlets skeptical of climate attribution, science, pointed out that this modeled figure didn't cleanly match the provisional all-cause mortality data published by the UK's own statistics agency, and argued that modeled estimates are hypotheses rather than confirmed counts. The researchers behind the modeling pushed back, noting that official all-mortality reports lag behind real-time events by design, and that the standard practice across public health epidemiology has always been to model excess deaths against historical baselines precisely because heat rarely appears as the sole cause of death on a certificate. Someone with existing heart disease who dies during a heat wave typically has heart disease listed as the cause, even though the heat was very plausibly what tipped the balance. That's not a flaw unique to this summer's reporting. It's a structural feature of how heat mortality has always been measured. And it means every headline death toll you see is, to some extent, a modeled estimate rather than a hand count, which is worth understanding rather than either blindly trusting or dismissing. Now, here's something that reframes this whole season and helps explain why researchers are taking the Southern Europe numbers so seriously. This isn't the first data point suggesting the old North-South resilience gap is narrowing. A major study, published in the Lancet Regional Health, using the same excess mortality methodology now being applied to this summer, found that heat killed more than 70,000 people across Europe in the summer of 2022, a toll that included substantial and, at the time, unexpectedly high death rates in Spain, Italy, and Greece, the very countries the old model predicted should be comparatively sheltered. A separate Barcelona Institute for Global Health study covering the following year found nearly 48,000 heat deaths continent-wide, again with Southern Europe carrying a disproportionately heavy share relative to what historical acclimatization patterns would have predicted. Researchers involved in that work, including lead author Joan Ballister-Claremont, have been explicit that summers like these can no longer be treated as one-off oddities. The 2026 numbers aren't an isolated anomaly interrupting an otherwise reassuring trend. They're the continuation of a pattern that's been building for at least 4 consecutive years, one record-breaking summer at a time, each one chipping away a little more at the assumption that Mediterranean acclimatization would keep pace with Mediterranean warming. Which brings us to the claim you'll see floating around, the one that says this proves acclimatization research was simply wrong all along, and that decades of epidemiological findings should be thrown out. The evidence doesn't support that framing either, and the reasons are specific. Acclimatization is real, measurable, and still detectable in the data. For a given daytime temperature that falls within the range a population has genuinely experienced before, Mediterranean countries still show a flatter mortality response than northern ones. What's changing isn't the existence of acclimatization. It's that the climate has started producing conditions, specifically those relentless, record-breaking overnight lows that sit outside the range those adaptations were ever built to handle. That's a narrower, more precise finding than adaptation doesn't work. And it's also a more useful one because it points researchers toward exactly what needs to change: building design and public health interventions that specifically address nighttime cooling rather than a wholesale abandonment of everything epidemiologists thought they understood. So here's what actually matters going forward. This is the payoff I promised you at the start. The number to watch in future heatwave coverage isn't the daytime peak temperature that dominates the headlines. It's the overnight minimum, and specifically how far that minimum sits above the historical average for that location. A daytime high that breaks a record is dramatic, but researchers increasingly view it as a secondary signal. A nighttime low that fails to drop into a genuinely recovery-enabling range, night after night across a multi-day heatwave, is now understood as the more dangerous marker, the one that erodes acclimatization's protective effect and starts pushing even well-adapted populations toward the kind of death tolls we've now seen for 4 summers running. If you want to gauge how serious the next heatwave really is, don't just check tomorrow's high. Check how low it's actually expected to get tonight. There's something almost reassuring in watching this play out, isn't there? Not the false comfort of assuming decades-old assumptions were flawless and unchanging, and not the manufactured despair of assuming nothing we've learned about human resilience still applies. But the real, grounded process of scientists noticing that the data has started disagreeing with the model and doing the careful work of figuring out exactly why, rather than either ignoring the mismatch or overcorrecting into panic. Southern Europe's brutal summer wasn't a random, that researchers can now tell you almost exactly what changed and why the old rulebook stopped predicting it. If this made that shift feel a little more understandable and a little less like an unexplainable tragedy, do me a favor and hit that like button, because it genuinely helps this kind of careful, no hype science reach more people. Subscribe so you're here when the next mortality data comes in, because this reassessment is still very much ongoing. And tell me down in the comments, do you want me to keep tracking how this research develops as the rest of the summer plays out? I read every single one, and your questions often shape the next video. I'll see you in the next one.